I was in the ICU for 8 days, breathing through a tube, unable to speak, unable to move, but I could hear everything. I heard the doctors, I heard the nurses, and on the 8th day I heard my children. They hadn't come to hold my hand or pray for my recovery. They came to stand over my paralyzed body and ask each other in hushed, urgent whispers where I kept my will. They thought I was already a ghost, a collection of assets waiting to be distributed. They were about to find out that not only was I very much alive, but I was about to make sure the only thing they would ever inherit from me was the painful lesson of what happens when you count a matriarch out before she's taken her last breath. Before I begin, thank you for being here. For being part of this community. If you believe in the power of a woman finding her voice and reclaiming her life, then you are in the right place. Please, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It truly means the world to me. Now let me tell you what they did to me. My name is Cynthia Monroe, and for 45 years, my world was defined by texture, color, and the elegant, unspoken language of a well-designed room. I was the founder and creative force behind Monroe Interiors, a firm that became synonymous with the restoration of Atlanta's historic homes. I didn't just decorate houses, I curated them. I was a historian of beauty, a woman who could tell the story of a home through the grain of its wood, the pattern of its fabrics, and the light that fell through its windows. My life was a testament to the belief that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that a home should be a fortress for the soul. My own fortress, my masterpiece, is a grand 1910 Tudor revival in Annesley Park, a magnificent house that I spent a decade restoring from a state of near ruin. It is not merely a collection of rooms. It is a living museum of my life's work and passions. The foyer is paneled in dark, rich mahogany reclaimed from a pre-war hotel. The library's shelves are filled with first-edition books on architecture and art, their spines a testament to a lifetime of study. The walls are adorned not with prints, but with original works of art I collected over the years. A Romari Bearden collage here, an early Jacob Lawrence there. Each piece of furniture, each Persian rug, each porcelain vase has a story, a provenance. This house is my legacy, the physical manifestation of a life spent in the pursuit of enduring beauty. My late husband, Robert, shared my vision. He was a man who understood that the value of a thing was in its history, not its price tag. Together we built an empire of taste, and we raised 2 children within these historic walls, Lawrence and Victoria. They were my other great project. I poured into them all the resources I had never had. I gave them the finest educations. Lawrence an MBA from Emory, Victoria a degree in art history from Smith. I provided the seed money for Lawrence's first commercial real estate venture and the down payment for the sprawling Buckhead mansion Victoria now occupies with her husband, the state senator. I believed I was giving them a foundation, just as I had given one to the crumbling houses I restored. I thought I was teaching them to appreciate the value of a legacy. I did not realize they were only learning to appreciate its price. In my retirement, my life settled into a quiet, elegant rhythm. My days were spent tending to my gardens, corresponding with museums about my art collection, and enjoying the quiet grandeur of the home I had created. My children were busy with their own lives, their own ambitions. Lawrence was always chasing his next big real estate deal, his conversations with me often circling back to the untapped potential of my Annesley Park property. "You know, Mother," he'd say, gazing out at the manicured lawn, "this land alone is worth a fortune. A developer could do incredible things here." He saw my home not as a historic treasure but as an underperforming asset. Victoria, on the other hand, was the perfect political wife, her life a whirlwind of charity luncheons and fundraising galas. She loved to bring her influential friends to my home, showing it off as if it were her own. "My mother has such a wonderful eye," she would say, her voice dripping with pride. But her appreciation was for the status the house conferred upon her, not for the soul within its walls. She saw the Bearden on my wall not as a masterpiece of African American art, but as a conversation starter, a piece of social currency. I chose to see their behavior as a reflection of their own worlds. Lawrence's pragmatism, Victoria's social ambition. I was the matriarch, the provider, and their success I believed was an extension of my own. My love for them was a blind spot, a beautifully furnished room in my heart with the curtains drawn tight against any unpleasant truths. The day the foundations of my life cracked was a perfectly ordinary Monday in April. I was in my library cataloging some new acquisitions, when a strange tightness gripped my chest. It wasn't a sharp pain but a deep, crushing pressure, as if the weight of all the books in the room had suddenly settled upon me. My breath grew short, shallow. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and the room began to tilt, the spines of the books blurring into meaningless streaks of color. I remember reaching for the heavy oak desk to steady myself, and then nothing. I woke up to the disorienting, sterile whiteness of a hospital room. A doctor with kind, tired eyes was standing over me. He told me I had suffered from a severe case of acute pneumonia that had quickly developed into sepsis. My body, he explained, had gone into shock. I was lucky to be alive. The words felt distant, unreal. I, Cynthia Monroe, a woman who had commanded boardrooms and construction sites, was now a frail patient in a flimsy hospital gown, my life suddenly, terrifyingly, out of my own hands. They moved me to the intensive care unit. The world shrank to the size of a small, glass-walled room, a universe of beeping machines, intravenous drips, and the constant rhythmic hiss of a ventilator that was now breathing for me. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, unable to move, unable to speak. But I was aware. My mind, the designer's mind that saw every detail, every nuance, was as sharp as ever. I was a silent, helpless observer of my own precarious existence. And I was about to learn that the greatest threat to my life was not the illness that had ravaged my body, but the two people I had given it to. The ICU was a place outside of time. Day and night blurred into a continuous, monotonous loop, measured only by the changing shifts of the nurses and the rhythmic pulse of the machines that were keeping me alive. I lay on my back, a tube down my throat, my arms a roadmap of 4 lines and monitor wires. I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't lift a finger. My only power was to open and close my eyes, to listen and to think. And oh, how I thought. I thought about my life, my husband, my work. And I waited for my children. A day passed. Then 5. The nurses would come in, their faces a mixture of professional cheer and pity. Your son called for an update, one would say. Your daughter is very concerned, she's checking in constantly, another would offer. But they did not come. For 7 days my bedside was a place visited only by medical staff. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the symphony of beeps and hisses, and a cold, terrifying loneliness began to seep into the cracks of my consciousness. On the 8th day they appeared. I saw them through the glass wall of my room before they entered. Lawrence in a severe dark suit, Victoria in a somber but impeccably tailored dress. They looked like they were attending a funeral. My funeral. They entered the room and stood at the foot of my bed, their faces arranged into masks of grave concern. "Oh, Mommy," Victoria whispered, her voice catching in a theatrical sob. She reached out and touched my foot, a tentative, fleeting gesture as if she were afraid of catching my illness. "You look so fragile." Lawrence didn't speak. He just stared at me, his eyes not filled with worry for my well-being, but with a cool, detached appraisal. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was assessing a situation, a problem to be managed. They stood there for a few moments in silence, the only sounds the relentless hiss of the ventilator and the steady beep of my heart monitor. Then, believing I was sedated, unconscious, a mere shell of a person, they began to talk to each other, their voices low and urgent, forgetting, or perhaps not caring, that the woman whose life hung in the balance could hear every single word. "Did you talk to the doctor?" Victoria asked, her voice a nervous whisper. "What did he say? Is she going to?" "He was non-committal," Lawrence replied, his tone clipped and impatient. "It's serious. That's all they'll say. We need to be practical here, Victoria." "Practical?" "Lawrence, she's our mother," Victoria said, but there was no conviction in her voice. It was a line she felt she was supposed to say. "And I am aware of that," he shot back. "But she's also a woman with a significant and highly complex estate. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about what happens if she doesn't recover?" The air in the room grew cold. The beep of my heart monitor seemed to grow louder, a frantic, desperate metronome counting down the seconds to my own betrayal. "Don't talk like that," Victoria whispered, but her voice was weak. "We have to talk like that," Lawrence insisted, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense. "The house, the art collection, the portfolio, it's a mess. I've been trying to tell her for years to simplify, to liquidate. Do you have any idea where her documents are? The will, the trust agreements, the insurance policies." I wanted to scream. I wanted to rise from the bed and slap the cold, pragmatic look off his face. I wanted to tell him that my will was my business, that my life was not a line item on his balance sheet. But I could do nothing. I could only lie there, paralyzed, and listen as my own children began to pick over the bones of my life before I was even dead. I don't know, Victoria fretted, her voice now laced with a genuine panic that had nothing to do with my health and everything to do with her financial security. She keeps everything in that old safe in the library. I don't know the combination. She's always been so private about it. Exactly, Lawrence said, a sharp note of triumph in his voice. Private. And disorganized. It'd take months, years for probate to sort this out. My development deal for the Midtown Tower is closing in 6 months. I was counting on leveraging my portion of the estate for the financing. This is a logistical nightmare. A logistical nightmare. My potential death was a logistical nightmare for his business deal. The words were a physical blow. I felt a rage so pure, so potent, it was a miracle it didn't register on the machines beside me. And what about me? Victoria chimed in, her voice thin and reedy with self-pity. Richard's campaign for the Senate is going to kick off next year. We need to be hosting fundraisers. We need to be seen. If the estate is tied up in probate, we'll be ruined. They were vultures. Standing over my still warm body, squabbling over the carcass. They weren't mourning the potential loss of their mother. They were mourning the potential loss of their access to my money. My love, my support, my lifetime of provision had not created gratitude. It had created a monstrous, insatiable entitlement. The conversation continued, a litany of their own selfish fears. They spoke of my art collection in terms of auction estimates. They spoke of my historic home in terms of its value per square foot. They spoke of my life's work, my passion, my soul as a series of assets to be divided and liquidated. Not once did they speak of me. Not once did they say, I hope she gets better. Not once did they express love. They stayed for perhaps 15 minutes, their morbid and practical discussion finally winding down. Lawrence looked at his expensive watch. I have a conference call. We'll come back tomorrow. Victoria nodded, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. Yes. We should go. She gave my foot another fleeting, sterile pat. Rest, Mommy, she whispered. Then they were gone. They left me alone in the sterile, silent room, with the hiss of the ventilator and the echo of their words. The rage I had felt began to subside, washed away by a tidal wave of grief so profound it felt like it would drown me. The illness had attacked my body, but my children, my own flesh and blood, had just delivered a mortal wound to my spirit. They had shown me their true hearts. And in doing so they had just signed their own disinheritance. They just didn't know it yet. For the next 24 hours I floated in a sea of grief. The betrayal was a poison, seeping into every part of my being, more potent than any infection the doctors were fighting. Every beep of the heart monitor sounded like a tick of a clock, counting down not my life, but the life of the mother I had been. The loving, trusting, willfully blind woman who had believed her children were her greatest creation. That woman died in the ICU on the 8th day. The person who began to emerge in her place was someone new, someone colder, clearer, and infinitely more dangerous. The turning point came during the quiet, pre-dawn hours of the following day. A nurse was gently checking my vitals, her movements efficient and kind. She adjusted my pillow, and for a moment, my head turned just enough that I could see my own reflection in the dark blank screen of a nearby monitor. I saw a pale, ravaged face, a mess of tubes and wires, a picture of absolute vulnerability. I saw what my children had seen, a problem to be managed, an estate to be settled. And in that moment the grief began to recede and something else took its place. It was the familiar, formidable spirit of the designer, the architect, the problem solver. It was the spirit of Cynthia Monroe. My entire life had been about design. I took flawed, broken structures and I redesigned them. I saw their hidden potential, their structural weaknesses, and I created a new plan, a better, stronger, more beautiful vision. And as I lay there, paralyzed and silent, I realized the design of my own life, the legacy I had so carefully planned, was fundamentally flawed. Its primary weakness was its beneficiaries. My legacy was not meant to be a pile of cash. It was meant to be a testament to a set of values: beauty, history, craftsmanship, and the importance of preserving the past to enrich the future. I had spent my life saving historic buildings from the wrecking ball, fighting against developers like my own son who saw only land value and not architectural soul. I had curated my art collection not as an investment, but as a conversation with history. My home was not a house, it was a statement. And I was planning to leave it all to two people who would have a for sale sign on the lawn before my obituary was published in the paper. Lawrence would sell the house to the highest bidder, who would undoubtedly tear it down to build a block of soulless condominiums. Victoria would auction off the art to fund her husband's political ambitions. The masterpieces of black artists scattered to the winds, their cultural significance erased in favor of a quick profit. They would take the beautiful, intricate tapestry of my life and they would unravel it, selling off each thread until nothing was left. The thought was more terrifying than death itself. The idea that my life's work would be so utterly, so callously dismantled was unacceptable. The betrayal was no longer just a source of pain. It was a design problem, the most important one I had ever faced. How do you protect a legacy of beauty from people who only understand value? How do you preserve a history for people who have no sense of the past? The answer came to me with the force of a revelation. You don't give it to them. You redesign the entire structure of the inheritance. You create a new foundation, one so strong, so legally impenetrable, that their greedy hands can never touch it. A new sense of purpose flooded my body, a jolt of adrenaline more powerful than any drug in my Ford drip. My recovery, I decided in that moment, was no longer a passive process. It was an act of will. It was a race against time. I needed to get better, not just to live but to execute my new design. Every painful breath I took, every small victory against the illness, was a step towards reclaiming my power. The doctors and nurses noted the change in me. They called it a remarkable turnaround. My vital signs stabilized. My fever broke. They didn't understand that my body was responding to the sudden, urgent command of my mind. I had a project. I had a plan. And Cynthia Monroe always finished her projects. When they finally removed the ventilator, the first words I rasped, my throat raw, were not to my children, who had continued their brief, perfunctory visits. My first words were to my nurse. My phone, I whispered. And my lawyer's number. The nurse, bless her heart, saw the fierce, unyielding determination in my eyes. She didn't question me. She simply nodded and brought me the phone. My children had made a fatal error. They had looked at my weakened body and assumed a weakened mind. They had mistaken my silence for absence. But a designer does her most important work in silence, in the quiet spaces where she can see the whole structure, identify its flaws, and draw up the plans for something new, something better, something that will last forever. I was no longer just a patient fighting an illness. I was the architect of my own legacy, and I was about to break ground on a new foundation that would be my masterpiece. The journey from the ICU to my own home was a long and arduous one, each step a small victory. When I was finally discharged, I was still weak, still dependent on an in-home nurse and a physical therapist, but my mind was a whirlwind of activity. I had used my time in the hospital's recovery wing to begin my work, my whispered, raspy phone calls to my lawyer Franklin Hayes, laying the groundwork for my grand design. Franklin was more than just my lawyer. He was a friend of 30 years, a man who had helped me navigate the legal complexities of my business and who had shared many a dinner with me and Robert. He was a man who understood me. When I told him what had happened in the ICU, his silence on the other end of the line was filled with a cold, palpable anger. "The ungrateful, short-sighted fools," he had finally said. "Cynthia, what do you want to do?" "I want to protect my life's work, Franklin," I had replied, my voice growing stronger with every word. "I want to build a fortress." And so we began. My home, once a place of quiet retirement, became a secret command center. My perceived weakness was my greatest asset. Lawrence and Victoria would visit, bringing flowers and platitudes, their faces masks of filial concern. They would see me sitting in my armchair by the window, a frail old woman wrapped in a cashmere shawl, and they would assume I was fading. They had no idea that from that armchair I was conducting conference calls, reviewing legal documents, and systematically dismantling their future. My plan was not simply to rewrite my will. A will could be contested, challenged. My children, with their teams of expensive lawyers, could try to argue that I was not of sound mind, that I had been unduly influenced. No, my plan was far more elegant, more absolute. I was not going to change my will. I was going to make it obsolete. Working with Franklin and my most trusted financial advisor, a brilliant woman named Alana James, we began the process of creating a new legal entity. It was to be called the Monroe Foundation for Historic Preservation and Design. It was not a simple trust. It was a formal, state-chartered, non-profit charitable foundation. Its mission, as we drafted it in a series of meticulous, ironclad documents, was to preserve historically and architecturally significant properties, to maintain and display my art collection for public benefit, and to provide scholarships to promising young interior design students from underserved communities. "This is the fortress, Cynthia," Franklin explained as we reviewed the final charter. "Once an asset is irrevocably transferred to a charitable foundation like this, it is no longer part of your personal estate. It cannot be touched by heirs. It cannot be contested in probate. It belongs to the foundation in perpetuity." In perpetuity. The words were music to my ears. The process was complex and required my full mental engagement. There were tax implications to consider, board members to select, and the painstaking legal process of transferring every single asset I owned into the foundation's name. We started with the house. Franklin's firm drew up the new deed, transferring the ownership of my beloved Ansley Park home from Cynthia Monroe to the Monroe Foundation. I signed it with a steady hand, the signature of a woman fully in command of her faculties. Next came the art. Alana James worked with an appraiser and an art historian to create a complete, museum-quality catalog of my collection. Each piece, from the Romari Bearden collage to the smallest piece of antique silver, was legally gifted to the foundation. Its future was no longer at the mercy of an auction house gavel, but secured for public study and appreciation. Finally, we addressed the financial portfolio, the vast collection of stocks, bonds, and investments that Robert and I had so carefully built over a lifetime. This was the liquid asset my children were so eager to get their hands on. Alana systematically transferred every last dollar into a new set of endowment and operating accounts under the foundation's name. The process took nearly 3 months. During that time, I played the part of the frail, recovering invalid flawlessly. I allowed my children to fuss over me, to bring me soup, to talk down to me in soothing, patronizing tones. I listened to Lawrence complain about the rising cost of construction materials and Victoria fret about the caterer for her husband's next fundraiser. I nodded and smiled, a silent, knowing sphinx, all the while watching my fortress being built, stone by legal stone. The final step was selecting the foundation's board of directors. This was my favorite part of the project. I did not choose family members. I chose a panel of the most respected people I knew in their fields. The director of the High Museum of Art, the dean of the architecture school at Georgia Tech, a celebrated historian of the American South, and my dear friend and lawyer Franklin Hayes. They were to be the guardians of my legacy, a council of experts who understood and shared my values. By the time autumn began to paint the leaves in Ansley Park with shades of gold and crimson, the work was done. My personal net worth was now effectively zero. I was on paper a woman of no means. I lived in a house I did not own, surrounded by art that did not belong to me. I had given everything away, and in doing so I had saved it all. The design was complete. The structure was sound. All that was left was the grand reveal. I waited for the perfect moment. I let another month pass, allowing the legal dust to settle completely, ensuring every T was crossed and every I was dotted. I wanted my new foundation to be an unbreachable, undeniable fact before I unveiled it. During this time I focused on my recovery, my secret purpose giving me a strength that amazed my doctors. I graduated from a wheelchair to a walker and then to a simple, elegant ebony cane. My speech, though still slower than it once was, returned to its former clarity and precision. The frail woman my children had dismissed was gone, replaced by the matriarch they had forgotten. I finally summoned them on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in November. I did not text them. I had my nurse send a formal engraved invitation by courier, just as I would have for one of my old society events. It requested their presence at my home for a meeting to discuss the future of the family estate. The bait was irresistible. They arrived precisely on time, their faces alight with a barely concealed, predatory excitement. They saw the formal invitation not as a sign of my returning strength, but as a sign of my final surrender. This, they believed, was the day the old woman would finally lay out the terms of their inheritance. Lawrence was in a dark, funereal suit, looking like a man ready to take charge. Victoria was in a tasteful Chanel dress, her expression one of solemn, lucrative grief. They walked into my library, the room where I had collapsed months before, and found me seated not in my usual armchair, but at the head of the great oak table. On either side of me sat my lawyer, Franklin Hayes, and my financial advisor, Alana James. The festive, expectant looks on my children's faces faltered. This was not the scene they had anticipated. This looked less like a family chat and more like a corporate board meeting. "Mother," Lawrence began, his voice a little tight. "What is all this? I thought we were just going to talk." "We are going to talk, Lawrence," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying an authority he had not heard in a long time. "But first we are going to listen. Franklin has a presentation to make." I nodded to Franklin. He opened a handsome leather portfolio and looked at my children, his expression devoid of any warmth. "Lawrence, Victoria," he began, his tone formal and dry. "Your mother has asked me to brief you on some recent and significant changes to her estate planning. She has been very busy these past few months." I watched my children's faces. I saw a flicker of panic in their eyes, the fear that I might have changed the percentages in my will, perhaps given one more than the other. They had no idea of the scale of the cataclysm that was about to befall them. "Your mother," Franklin continued, "has come to the conclusion that her estate, the house, its contents, and her financial portfolio, constitutes a significant cultural and historical legacy. A legacy that she feels requires a more permanent and professional stewardship than a simple inheritance can provide." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Lawrence shifted in his seat, impatient. "What does that mean, Franklin? Get to the point." "Very well," Franklin said. He slid two thick, beautifully bound documents across the polished table, one in front of Lawrence, one in front of Victoria. "The point, Lawrence, is the Monroe Foundation for Historic Preservation and Design." They stared at the documents, the embossed gold lettering on the cover seeming to mock them. "The what?" Victoria whispered. "It is a non-profit charitable foundation," Franklin explained, his voice as sharp as a guillotine's blade. "Chartered by the state, recognized by the IRS. And as of October 1st of this year, it is the sole and legal owner of this house, all of the art and furnishings within it, and the entirety of your mother's financial assets. The transfer is complete, legal, and irrevocable." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a universe collapsing. I watched as the color drained from Lawrence's face, replaced by a blotchy, furious red. Victoria's perfectly made-up face seemed to crumble, her mouth opening and closing silently. "What are you talking about?" Lawrence finally exploded, slamming his hand on the table. "You gave it away. You gave our inheritance away." "I have given nothing away, Lawrence," I said, my voice cutting through his rage like a diamond drill. "I have preserved it. And it was never your inheritance. It was my life's work. A fact you seem to have forgotten." "This is illegal," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Franklin. "You took advantage of her. She wasn't in her right mind." Franklin smiled, a cold, thin smile. "I assure you, your mother has never been more in her right mind. We have a full psychiatric evaluation conducted 3 weeks ago, confirming her complete cognitive competence. We have video recordings of every signing. We have built an ironclad legal fortress, Lawrence. There are no cracks for you to slip through." Victoria finally found her voice, a pathetic, weeping sound. But what about us? What's left for us?" I looked at my daughter, at her tear-streaked, desperate face, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. "For you," I said. "For you, there is the memory of a mother who gave you everything, and to whom you offered nothing in her hour of need. You came to my deathbed to ask about my will. So this is my will. My will is that my legacy is protected from your greed. My will is that my life's work will serve a purpose greater than funding your next real estate deal or your husband's next political campaign." I stood up then, leaning only slightly on my ebony cane. I was no longer the invalid in the armchair. I was the master of my house, the architect of my destiny. "The meeting is over," I announced. "Franklin will see you out." They were left sitting there, stunned into silence, clutching the useless documents that detailed the charter of a foundation that had just erased their future. They had come expecting a reading of a will, a distribution of assets. And in a way they had gotten one. I had read their hearts, found them wanting, and distributed my assets accordingly. They had inherited exactly what they deserved. Nothing. The aftermath of the meeting was not the fiery explosion I might have anticipated, but the cold, silent implosion of two lives that had been built on the expectation of my wealth. My children left my house that day in a state of stunned disbelief. The beautifully bound charters of the foundation left behind on the library table like unexploded bombs. For a few weeks I heard nothing. Then came the predictable flurry of angry letters from their lawyers. They were filled with bluster and threats, accusations of undue influence and lack of capacity. Franklin responded to each with a brief, dismissive letter, attaching a copy of my psychiatric evaluation and a link to the video recordings of the signings. The legal challenges sputtered and died before they could even begin. The fortress I had built was, as promised, unbreachable. The true consequences for them unfolded in their own lives, news of which trickled back to me through the quiet channels of Atlanta society. Lawrence's ambitious Midtown Tower project, the one for which he was counting on his inheritance, collapsed. Unable to secure the financing without the collateral of my estate, his partners pulled out, and the deal fell apart in a cascade of lawsuits and financial penalties. His reputation as a developer with the golden touch was shattered. He was just another man who had over-leveraged and failed. Victoria's downfall was quieter but no less devastating. Without the steady infusion of family dividends to prop up their lavish lifestyle, the precarious financial house of cards she and her husband had built began to wobble. They had to sell their massive Buckhead mansion, downsizing to a far less impressive home in a less prestigious neighborhood. Her husband's Senate campaign was postponed indefinitely, the official reason being family matters. The truth was that without my money to fuel the engine, his political ambitions had run out of gas. Victoria, the celebrated socialite, faded from the society pages, her status evaporating along with her credit line. They did not call me. They did not visit. Their silence was a testament to the fact that their connection to me had never been about love, only about money. With the money gone, there was nothing left to say. But my story, the true story, does not end with their ruin. It ends with my resurrection. My revenge was not in their failure but in my own success. The true legacy was not in what I had taken from them, but in what I was now building. The first official board meeting of the Monroe Foundation for Historic Preservation and Design was held 3 months later, in the formal dining room of my home, the foundation's new headquarters. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, not as a frail invalid, but as the chairwoman of the board. Around me sat the esteemed group I had chosen: the museum director, the university dean, the historian, and Franklin. The air was filled with energy, with purpose, with a shared passion for the mission we were about to embark on. Alana James presented the financial reports, detailing the healthy endowment that would fund our work in perpetuity. We didn't speak of my children. We spoke of the future. We approved our first project, a grant to save a row of historic shotgun houses in the Sweet Auburn district, the historic heart of Black Atlanta. We reviewed the applications for our first scholarship, the Cynthia Monroe Prize in Design, to be awarded to a talented young Black student at the Savannah College of Art and Design. As I looked around the table at these brilliant, dedicated people, all committed to the preservation of the beauty and history I held so dear, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was my family now. This was my tribe. Later that afternoon, after the meeting had concluded, I walked through my home. It was no longer just my house. It was a promise. The Romari Bearden on the wall was no longer just my painting. It was the cornerstone of a public collection. The library was no longer just my library. It was a future research center for students of design. The house itself was no longer just my home. It was the first property to be officially preserved by the foundation that bore my name. I ended my walk in the sunroom, looking out at the gardens as the late afternoon light streamed through the glass. My children had seen my life's work as a pile of assets to be liquidated. They had seen me as a dying woman, an obstacle to their own desires. But their greed had been a gift. Their betrayal had been a catalyst. It had forced me to see my own legacy with clear eyes and to build something far greater and more enduring than a simple inheritance. They had wanted my will. And in the end I had shown it to them. Not a document on a piece of paper, but the indomitable will of a woman who refused to have her life's work erased. The will to survive. The will to protect. The will to build something beautiful that would last forever. And that was a legacy worth more than any amount of money. It was worth everything.